Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something called doxography.
Doxography.
Yeah,
The fun one.
it's a fun one. It sounds kind of intimidating, but really it's just about how we can understand ancient philosophers,
Right.
especially when so many of their original writings are lost.
Yeah.
So it's like we have this huge jigsaw puzzle
Yeah.
of ideas, but we only have like a handful of pieces.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? It's like detective work, but for philosophy.
I like that.
Yeah, we're piecing together ancient thought from just these little fragments and secondary sources, and we're trying to figure out, what these thinkers really believed.
So how do we even begin to do that?
Well, that's what we're going to dive into today.
Okay.
Our main guide for this deep dive is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on doxography of ancient philosophy.
Okay, so right off the bat,
Yeah.
what exactly is doxography?
So the Stanford Encyclopedia defines doxography as focusing on the core tenets or doctrines of these ancient philosophers. Not just, isolated quotes here and there.
Right.
It's about understanding their systematic beliefs, their arguments, their whole worldview, even if we don't have every single thing they wrote.
So it's not about just cherry-picking catchy phrases.
Right.
It's about, like, reconstructing an entire philosophical system.
Think of it this way, like, imagine trying to understand Plato, but all you have is what Aristotle wrote about him.
Oh, wow.
Would that be a complete picture? Would it even be accurate?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because Aristotle, had his own philosophical agenda, and his interpretation of Plato was probably, influenced by that.
Right, so he's going to be putting his own spin on it
Exactly.
to make Plato fit into his...
Exactly.
Exactly.
And to really understand those nuances, we have to look at the doxographers themselves.
Okay, so who are some of these key players in the doxography game?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions quite a few. You've got Cicero Diogenes, Laurentius Clement of Alexandria.
These names are familiar.
Yeah, it's an eclectic mix. Some were philosophers in their own right. Others were more like compilers or historians gathering and organizing information.
Diogenes Laertius, wasn't he the one known for, like, telling all the juicy anecdotes about the philosophers?
Yes, he was known for including all sorts of gossip and personal details,
So far.
which makes his work very entertaining. But, we also have to take his claims with a grain of salt.
Of course. Right, so it wasn't all just, like, dry academic stuff.
Not at all, no. But the article also talks about this scholar Hermann Diels, who really shaped the field of doxography with his work Doxography Graecii.
Okay.
He was really obsessed with tracing the lineage of sources,
Interesting.
trying to construct what they call a stemma, which is kind of like a family tree,
Okay.
to show how later doxographies were related to earlier ones.
So this is good, a genealogist.
Exactly.
The ideas.
Yeah, tracing how philosophical concepts evolved and got passed down.
So cool.
Yeah, and he believed he could trace many of these sources back to Theophrastus, who was Aristotle's student. And his work, Physicae Doxae.
Okay.
According to Diels, this work was like the foundation for a lot of later doxography. It's as if Theophrastus had access to this, like, secret vault of knowledge about earlier philosophers.
But wait, I thought we were talking about biases earlier.
Right.
Wouldn't Theophrastus, being Aristotle's student, have his own slant on things?
You're absolutely right. That's a key point. Diels might have overestimated Theophrastus's objectivity.
Incorrect.
Even if he had access to more sources, he would have interpreted them through his own philosophical lens.
Right.
We can't assume that any source is perfectly neutral. It's like listening to a cover version of a song.
Okay.
It might be based on the original, but the artist is going to add their own style and interpretation.
So even trying to trace back to, like, the original source is tricky.
It's very tricky.
It makes you wonder if we can ever really know what these ancient philosophers actually thought.
Yeah.
And speaking of influences, what about Aristotle himself? Where does he fit into all this?
Well, Aristotle was actually a doxographer himself in a way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he often began his treatises by surveying all these existing opinions on a certain topic before presenting his own views.
Huh.
He called it the dialectical method. It's like he's saying, here's what everyone else thinks, now here's why they're all wrong, and here's my brilliant solution.
So he used doxography as, like, a springboard
Exactly.
for his own arguments.
Yeah, very clever.
That's pretty smart.
Yeah, and this method likely influenced both Theophrastus and later doxographers. Doxography wasn't just about collecting and preserving information. It was also a tool for argumentation and debate, even persuasion.
So it's like ancient philosophical PR.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
Imagine like a Stoic philosopher using doxography to show how great their ethics were compared to, say, Epicureanism.
Yeah.
They would carefully select and present tenets that supported their own school of thought, showcasing it in the best possible light.
So even back then, they were kind of like shaping the narrative of philosophical history.
Precisely. And that brings us to another interesting point that the Stanford Encyclopedia raises is the variety of doxographical works.
Okay.
So you've got some like the Placida that were very concise and thematic, almost like philosophical dictionaries,
Oh, okay.
just listing key beliefs and doctrines.
So kind of like a quick reference guide.
Exactly. Yeah, like a philosophical data set.
I like that.
But then you have what they call broad doxography, which includes works like Cicero's Philosophical Dialogues or Diogenes Laertius's Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers.
Right.
These go beyond just listing tenets. They explore the context of those beliefs,
Okay.
the arguments for and against them, even like the personalities of the philosophers themselves.
So it's more like getting the behind-the-scenes story. Not just what they believed, but why and how they came to those beliefs.
Precisely. It's like the difference between looking up a word in the dictionary versus exploring its etymology and its nuances and its cultural significance.
Oh, wow.
You know, both are valuable, but they offer different levels of understanding.
Yeah, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, and it makes you think about how even in something like the Placida, which is very concise, you still get these hints of those debates and those rivalries between different schools of thought.
Right, they're still there.
Yeah, exactly. Doxography isn't just about, memorizing facts and figures. It's about immersing yourself in that world of ancient philosophy with all of its complexities and contradictions.
Right, and it's about understanding how those ideas,
Right.
even though they're ancient, they still resonate with us today.
Yeah.
They're part of this ongoing conversation about like the big questions, the human condition, the search for meaning.
Precisely. And that's why doxography is still so relevant today. It helps us understand the roots of our own philosophical traditions, to see the world through the eyes of those who came before us, even if it's through this lens of interpretation and reconstruction.
It's almost like we're having this conversation
Yeah.
with those ancient philosophers across centuries.
Exactly. And that conversation can be incredibly enriching, even if it's mediated through these layers of interpretation. It reminds us that philosophy isn't static.
Right.
It's an ongoing dialogue, a search for understanding that continues to this very day.
So for all its challenges, doxography offers us a way to connect with that rich tapestry of ancient philosophical thought.
Exactly. And it really highlights the detective work involved in doxography.
Yeah, it's like we're not just piecing together these philosophical puzzles, we're also trying to figure out the puzzle makers themselves.
Right.
But if we're always having to like question the reliability of our sources, how can we actually use doxography to understand ancient philosophy?
That's where the real skill comes in. It's not just about collecting and organizing the information, it's about critically analyzing it. You have to consider the context of each source, its potential biases, its relationship to other sources. It's a constant process of comparing, evaluating, and interpreting.
So it's not enough to just read what a doxographer wrote. We have to kind of read between the lines too.
Exactly. You're trying to reconstruct this puzzle where some pieces are missing and others are damaged, and you're not even sure what the final picture is supposed to look like.
It sounds incredibly challenging. It's like an academic obstacle course.
It is.
But I imagine it must be pretty rewarding when you start to see those connections emerge.
Oh, absolutely. When you start to identify the underlying arguments, the assumptions, you begin to glimpse the outlines of a lost philosophical system. It's a real thrill.
It's like those aha moments when you're working on a really tough puzzle and suddenly a whole section falls into place.
Exactly.
You mentioned earlier that the Stanford Encyclopedia talks about broad versus narrow doxography.
Yes.
Could you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Of course. So narrow doxography is what deals really focused on those concise thematic presentations of philosophical tenets like we see in the Placida.
Okay.
It's about presenting the what of ancient philosophy, the core beliefs and doctrines, almost like a philosophical data set.
So it's like a quick reference guide to the main ideas.
Yeah. Exactly. But then you have what we call broad doxography, which includes works like Cicero's Philosophical Dialogues or Diogenes Laertius's Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers.
Okay.
These go beyond just listing tenets. They actually explore the context of those beliefs, the arguments for and against them, even the personalities of the philosophers themselves.
So it's more like getting the behind-the-scenes story, understanding not just what they believed, but why and how those ideas came about.
Precisely. It's like the difference between looking up a word in a dictionary versus exploring its etymology, its nuances, its cultural significance.
Wow.
Both are valuable, but they offer very different levels of understanding.
Yeah, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, and it makes you think about how even in something like the Placida, even though it's very concise, you still get those hints of the debates and the rivalries between different schools of thought.
Right, they're still there lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. Doxography isn't just about, memorizing facts and figures. It's about immersing yourself in that world of ancient philosophy with all of its complexities and contradictions.
And it's about understanding how those ideas, even though they're ancient, they still resonate with us today.
Yeah.
They're part of this ongoing conversation about the big questions, the human condition, the search for meaning.
Precisely. And that's why doxography is still so relevant today. It helps us understand the roots of our own philosophical traditions, to see the world through the eyes of those who came before us, even if it's through this lens of interpretation and reconstruction.
It's almost like we're having a conversation with those ancient philosophers across the centuries.
Exactly. And that conversation can be incredibly enriching, even if it's mediated through these layers of interpretation. It reminds us that philosophy isn't static.
Right.
It's an ongoing dialogue, a search for understanding that continues to this very day.
So for all its challenges, doxography offers us a way to connect with that rich tapestry of ancient philosophical thought.
And for anyone who's interested in the history of ideas, it's an indispensable tool. It allows us to trace those philosophical lineages, to understand how different thinkers influenced one another, to appreciate just how deep and complex ancient thought really was.
It's like being given this box of puzzle pieces, but instead of a simple picture, you're trying to reconstruct an entire world of ideas.
A world that continues to shape our own understanding of ourselves, the universe, and everything in between.
Yeah, it really is like we're archaeologists, but instead of, digging for artifacts, we're digging for ideas.
And just like archaeologists have to be aware of how their own presence can disturb a site, we have to be mindful of our own biases and assumptions. The way we view the world today inevitably shapes how we interpret the past.
It makes you realize that there's no such thing as a perfectly objective viewpoint, even when we're studying something as seemingly distant as ancient philosophy.
That's what makes it so intellectually stimulating, though we're constantly challenging our own assumptions, grappling with these different perspectives, and realizing that there's always more to learn and discover.
It's like peeling back layers of an onion. You're constantly revealing new depths and complexities.
And in a way, that's the essence of philosophy, isn't it? Asking questions, challenging received wisdom, exploring those fundamental mysteries of existence. Doxography gives us this unique window into how those questions were tackled by some of the greatest minds in history.
Yeah, it's humbling and inspiring at the same time. Humbling because it shows how much we don't know, and inspiring because it shows just the enduring power of these ideas.
Absolutely. And even though we might never fully recover all the lost works of ancient philosophy, doxography allows us to keep those conversations alive,
Right.
to learn from those who came before us, to connect with that long lineage of philosophical inquiry.
So despite all the complexities and challenges, doxography ultimately gives us this incredible tool for understanding the evolution of philosophical thought.
And for anyone who's ever wondered where our own ideas come from, how our own ways of thinking have been shaped by the past, it's an essential field of study. Doxography allows us to trace those influences, those connections, to see how ideas have evolved over time.
It's a reminder that philosophy isn't just some abstract academic pursuit. It's deeply connected to our own lives, our own ways of understanding the world.
And I think that's a great point to emphasize. The study of doxography reminds us that philosophy is a living conversation, a dynamic process of questioning and exploration that spans millennia.
Yeah, it's an invitation to engage with those big questions, to challenge our own assumptions, and to continue that search for wisdom that's been going on for centuries. So for our listeners out there, we encourage you to delve a little deeper into this fascinating world. Check out that Stanford Encyclopedia article that we mentioned, explore the works of Cicero, Diogenes, Laertius, maybe even try your hand at reconstructing some of those ancient philosophical puzzles.
Because as we've seen today, the journey into ancient wisdom is never truly finished. It's an ongoing process of discovery, interpretation, and perhaps even a little bit of detective work. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into doxography.
And until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.